The night Lady Cecily Ashmore arrived at Vane Park in tears, the only person awake to receive her was the maid. It was past midnight in the third week of November, the kind of cold that settled into stone walls and refused to leave until April, and Nora Whitfield had been up since 5 in the morning. She had lit the fires before dawn, turned the linens in the guest rooms, aired the blue drawing room in advance of a visit that had not come, carried a full coal scuttle to the 3rd floor, and returned it empty, and spent the better part of the evening repairing the hem of a gown that had been torn at the door of the carriage house. Her hands ached. Her eyes were dry from candlelight. The rest of the house had gone to bed 2 hours ago, and she had been on her way there herself, candle in hand, when she heard the wheels on the gravel below. Too fast. Too late. Nothing like a scheduled arrival. She went to the front window first and looked. Then she went downstairs. She was the one who opened the door. Lady Cecily Vane, sister to the Duke of Ashmore, stood on the front step in a traveling cloak that had not been fastened properly, her hair coming loose from its pins, her face streaked with cold and something worse than cold. She was 19 years old, and she had the particular look of a young woman who has been holding herself together for exactly as long as she could manage, and has now, at the sight of a lit doorway, stopped managing entirely. The coachman was down from his box and looking uncertain. The horses blew steam into the dark air. The whole scene had the quality of something held together with great effort that had just been allowed to put itself down. "Is my brother home?" she said. Her voice was steady enough. The rest of her was not. "No, my lady," Nora said. "His Grace is in London until Thursday." Something in Lady Cecily's face came undone. Not dramatically. Not with the elaborate collapse of a young woman who has practiced distress in a mirror. Simply undone, the way a carefully knotted ribbon gives when the right thread is pulled. Quietly. Without announcement. She put her hand against the doorframe. The cold came in around her. She said nothing. Nora stepped back and held the door wider. "Come in out of the cold, my lady." She directed the coachman to the stables and arranged for his supper without making him wait. She did not send for the housekeeper. Mrs. Fellows was 64 and had a bad hip and no patience for scenes past 9 in the evening. She would be told in the morning and would manage admirably. But tonight she was not what was needed. She did not send for any of the other maids, who were asleep and would not have known what to do in any case. She brought Lady Cecily into the kitchen, which was the only room guaranteed to be warm at this hour. And she put the kettle on the hob, and she set bread and cold meat on the table, and she asked no questions. This was how it began. Nora Whitfield had been a maid at Vane Park for 3 years. She was 23 years old, the daughter of a village schoolmaster who had died when she was 17, and left her nothing but a trunk of books she could not afford to keep, and a legible hand she could. She was not beautiful in the way that rooms noticed. She had brown hair she wore flat and neat, gray eyes that took in more than she offered back, and a way of moving through a great house that suggested she understood perfectly well that her presence was functional rather than decorative, and had made a quiet peace with the fact long before she had come here. She was the sort of woman who was thanked by the people she served and forgotten 5 minutes after she left the room. Invisibility was her working condition, and she had learned to use it, to move through the architecture of a house like weather, present and unregistered, attending to what was needed before it was asked for. The Duke of Ashmore had never, in 3 years, forgotten her in 5 minutes. She did not know this with any certainty, which was its own kind of knowledge. The Duke of Ashmore, whose name was Edmund Vane, had become a duke at 27 when a horse had thrown his father on a wet morning in March, and he had been 34 now for 6 months. He was tall in the way that made rooms feel smaller, not because he was particularly broad, but because he carried himself as a man who had been the largest consequence in every room he entered since before he had wanted to be. He had dark hair with the first threads of silver at the temples, and a jaw that might have been carved from the same gray stone as the park's outer walls. He spoke infrequently, moved without haste, and had a particular stillness when he was watching something closely that most people in the house mistook for indifference or for the kind of inward withdrawal common to men of large responsibility. The footman thought him cold. The housekeeper respected him and feared him slightly. His sister adored him and could not always read him, which troubled her. It was not indifference. Nora knew this, though she had never said it aloud to anyone, including herself. She had first understood it 11 months ago, in January, when she had come into the library to bank the fire and found His Grace reading at the desk by the window, apparently oblivious to her presence in the way that members of the family were generally oblivious to the presence of the staff, which was an obliviousness she neither resented nor questioned. It was the natural order of the house, and she moved through it as easily as she moved through doorways. She had worked quietly, replaced the coals, smoothed the hearthrug, and was nearly at the door when he said, without looking up from his book, "The grate in the east passage is smoking again. The flue is probably blocked." She had stopped. She had turned. She had said, "I noticed that this morning, Your Grace. I have put a note for Hawkins." He had looked up then, briefly, with an expression she had spent more time than she would admit trying to classify. It was not surprise at being answered. It was not the absent courtesy a man directs at a useful piece of furniture. It was something more like the expression of a man who has looked directly at a thing he had already been aware of for some time. He had gone back to his book. She had gone back to work. Nothing had passed between them that could be reported to anyone. And yet, she had caught him watching her at the table linen inventory in March, in the moment before he looked away and said something about the silver to his steward. She had heard him redirect Lady Cecily's question about the kitchen garden accounts, in April, with a quiet directness. "Ask Whitfield. She tracks it more accurately than Fellows." She had rounded a corridor corner in June and nearly walked into his chest at the turn of the landing. And he had said, "Forgive me," with a gravity that was entirely unnecessary, when a gentleman nearly collided with a maid and had held himself still at the doorway in a particular manner, as though the doorway were hers, and he were a visitor to it, and had waited for her to pass. She had thought about it for 3 days afterward, during which she had been very efficient, and had reorganized 2 cupboards that did not require reorganizing. Lady Cecily knew none of this. On the night she arrived at Vane Park undone, she knew only that the maid who had opened the door had warm hands and a steady voice, and had asked no questions, and had put the kettle on without being told, and had placed cold meat on the table as though she had known there would be someone who had not eaten since mid-afternoon. She sat in the kitchen with her hands around a cup of tea, and she ate without meaning to, because the bread and meat were there, and she was hungry in the way that acute distress makes one hungry as a fact separate from desire. After a while she said, "I cannot go back." Nora sat across from her at the kitchen table. She did not ask where she could not go back to. She waited. "Lord Prescott," Lady Cecily said. "Edmund arranged it in September. He thought he was doing right by me. I know he did. The estate is well managed. The man is not unkind. The settlement is generous." She turned the cup in her hands. "He is not unkind," she said again, in the careful tone of a woman who has recently discovered that not unkind is a thinner protection than she had supposed. "His mother, however, is the most efficient cruelty I have encountered in a drawing-room. And she has made it perfectly clear that she regards me as beneath the match, and intends to spend however many years it takes. to make me feel it as she does." Nora said nothing. The fire settled. "She called me provincial," Lady Cecily said. "At dinner, in front of Lord Prescott and 2 of his sisters and a cousin I had only just met. She did it very pleasantly, the way one corrects a child without raising one's voice. She said I had the manners of a provincial, and that Edmund ought to have sent me to town for a season first, to have the county knocked off me." Lady Cecily set down her cup with great precision. "And Lord Prescott said nothing." The November wind moved against the kitchen windows. Outside, the gravel was still. The horses were long settled in the stables. "She has said it 3 times now," Lady Cecily continued. "Once to Lord Prescott directly, in what she styled a private conversation, but which she knew I would be told of. Once to his cousin, in the morning room, at a volume calculated for the hall. And once to me this evening, as I was dressing for supper, phrased as advice, as though she were offering me a kindness I was too simple to value." She looked up. Her voice had been entirely controlled throughout. Her hands, in her lap, were not. "I packed a bag. I told Lord Prescott I had developed a headache and needed a day's rest at Vane Park before the journey back to town. I drove here. If you have ever sat with a young woman in a warm kitchen in the middle of a cold night, while the world outside assembled itself into something she must face again in the morning, you know what the next hour felt like. Stay close. What she does with it matters." Nora poured more tea. She said, "What would you like me to do, my lady?" It was the right question, because it was not a question that assumed an answer. Lady Cecily's shoulders came down by a fraction. "I do not know," she said. "I only knew I needed to be somewhere that felt safe before Edmund comes home on Thursday, or I will say something in his presence that cannot be unsaid. And then everything he has arranged will be in pieces, because I could not hold my tongue." "Then you are safe here," Nora said. "I will have the east bedroom aired and warm within the hour. Mrs. Fellows will know by morning. His Grace will know Thursday." "He will be angry with me," Lady Cecily said. "He will be frightened for you," Nora said, "which will present as anger until he is certain you are unhurt. He manages fear by looking like anger. Once he knows you are well, the anger will go." Lady Cecily looked at her with the particular attention of someone who has just heard a true thing said plainly about a person everyone else speaks of, only in careful generalities. "You know him well," she said. Nora stood and carried both cups to the basin. "I know the household," she said, and went to air the east bedroom. The Duke of Ashmore arrived on Thursday afternoon, not at the measured pace of a man making a scheduled return, but in a curricle driven harder than the roads from London warranted, with his coat collar turned up against the cold and a set to his face that the groom, who had been at Vane Park for 9 years, and who had seen his Grace's face in all its varieties, recognized as the expression he wore when something had gone wrong before anyone had told him precisely what. He was in the house and at the top of the main staircase before the footman had finished announcing him, and it was there, on the landing outside the east bedroom door, that he came face to face with Nora. She had a tray. She had been bringing Lady Cecily her morning chocolate, which had become a small and gentle daily accommodation, because Lady Cecily had not yet been able to face the full dining room, and this seemed to Nora a reasonable and temporary thing. His Grace stopped. He looked at her, then at the door, then back at her. He was taking stock, she could see, of what was before him, the tray, the closed door, her face. "She is unhurt," Nora said, because this was the information he needed before anything else could be discussed. "She is well and rested. She has been distressed since Monday about having come here, and about what you would think, and she has asked every morning whether Thursday has come yet." A great deal happened in the Duke of Ashmore's face that he did not allow to become fully visible. His jaw released by 1 degree. His breath came out and then went back to its normal depth. He said, "How long has she been here?" "Since Monday night, Your Grace." "Who attended her?" "Myself, primarily, through Monday night and Tuesday. Mrs. Fellows since Tuesday morning, when I informed her. Lady Cecily has been comfortable and has eaten." He was quiet for a moment. He was looking at her with an expression she had spent 11 months carefully refusing to read. "You were the one who opened the door," he said. It was not a question. He had already understood this. "I was awake," Nora said. "You kept her calm through the night." "She kept herself calm," Nora said. "She was distressed and she was frightened, but she was not undone. She is steadier than she believes herself to be." Something moved through his face at this, swift and then gone, like light crossing stone when a cloud passes overhead. He said, "Thank you, Whitfield." He said her name the way he had always said it. And yet, she had learned by this point to hear the difference between the way people said words and the weight they placed behind them. Because in a household where so much of communication was functional and abbreviated, the weight was where the meaning lived. He said her name, and the weight behind it was different. She could not have articulated the difference to anyone, could not have named the exact quality that had shifted. She knew only that it had shifted, and that her breath did something brief and involuntary, and that she looked down at the tray before she looked back at him. "Your Grace," she said, and went into the east bedroom. He stood outside the door for 1 beat longer than was necessary before she heard him walk away. He spoke with Lady Cecily for 2 hours. Nora heard none of it. She occupied herself with the first-floor linen cupboard, which had been needing reorganization for a fortnight, and which provided the particular satisfaction of a task with a clear beginning and a clear end, and she told herself that the conversation in the east bedroom concerned her Grace and his Grace, and had nothing to do with her, and that whatever was decided, there was no concern of hers. And she repeated both of these things with diminishing conviction until she ran out of linen to fold. At 4 in the afternoon, Lady Cecily appeared in the doorway of the linen cupboard, looking considerably lighter in her face than she had on Monday night. "He is not angry," she said. "I am glad," Nora said. "He wants to write to Lord Prescott directly, not to dissolve anything. To make clear that the arrangement is conditional on Cecily's ease within it, and that the conditions obtaining at Prescott's estate require correction before any further steps are taken." Lady Cecily leaned against the doorframe. He was very quiet when he said it. He had a particular look. Nora continued folding. "Yes," she said. "He asked how I had been treated here," Lady Cecily said. "I told him you had not once made me feel like a burden, which I was, and that you had not asked me anything I did not wish to answer, and that you had been kinder than I had any right to expect." She paused. He said, "Yes, that is like her." And then he was quiet for rather a long time, looking at the window. Not at anything outside the window, just at the window. Lady Cecily was watching Nora with the particular attentiveness of a young woman who has had a week with very little to do but observe. "Are you well, Whitfield?" "Quite well, my lady," Nora said. Lady Cecily smiled, very small and very knowing, and went back down the corridor. The days that followed were not days in which anything of consequence occurred. This was the particular difficulty. Edmund Vane remained at Vane Park through the following week, attending to estate business that had accumulated in London's absence. This meant that Nora encountered him with the regularity of ordinary household life, which was entirely normal and entirely unremarkable, and which she felt at each encounter with a precision she found increasingly difficult to attribute to any professional category. He was in the library on Friday evening when she came to bank the fire, and he did not acknowledge her entry. And she worked quietly and was nearly gone when he said, without looking up from the ledger before him, "How is she?" Not Lady Cecily, whose name he would have used. She. As though there was only one she he needed to specify. Nora said Lady Cecily had eaten a good supper and had asked for the heavier shawl from the east wardrobe, and had seemed well. He said nothing further, and she left. He was at the top of the east staircase on Saturday morning when she was carrying linen down, and he stepped back and waited without being asked, and as she passed he said, "Whitfield, is there a problem with the flue in the morning room? I thought I smelled smoke last evening." She said there was not. She had checked it Wednesday and found it clear. He said, "Good," and the word had more duration than words of that kind usually required. He was in the kitchen garden on Sunday afternoon, standing at the low stone wall that looked out over the park, his hands in his coat pockets, apparently doing nothing. It was the sort of thing a man does when he is thinking, and does not wish to think indoors. She was cutting the last of the dried rosemary before the frost made it unusable, her basket half full, her back to him, when he said, without turning, "How did you know she had not eaten when she arrived?" Nora straightened. She said, "I beg your pardon, Your Grace. My sister. You put bread and cold meat on the table before she had said a word to you about it. She told me. She said you put it there without asking." She had been traveling since afternoon, Nora said. It was past midnight. It seemed more probable than not. He turned then. He looked at her across the garden path between them, and there was a quality to it, to the way he looked at her, that made the cold feel like something other than cold. "You pay attention," he said. "It is part of the work," she said. "It is not part of the work in any other household I have encountered," he said. "It is a habit of character. I would ask you not to diminish it by calling it the work." She had nothing to say to this. She looked at him for one unguarded moment, which was a moment longer than she had permitted herself in 11 months, before she said, "I should bring these in before they go damp," and walked past him and into the kitchen, and did not run, which required more composure than she had known she was in possession of. She thought about it for 2 days. She thought about it in exactly the way she had trained herself not to think about glances across rooms and unnecessary gravity in doorways, which was to say she thought about it continuously while maintaining the strict fiction that she was not thinking about it at all. She was a maid. He was a duke. The architecture of the world they both inhabited was not merely convention. It was the actual physical structure of the house, the precise distance of the back stairs from the front stairs, the different doors through which they entered and left every room. She had not confused herself about this in 3 years, and she saw no merit in beginning now. But then there was the word he had used. Character. Not diligence. Not competence. Character. She was thinking about this. On Tuesday morning, while polishing the morning room candlesticks, when the second post arrived, it came addressed to His Grace from the household of Lord Prescott. Nora carried it to the study on the tray with the rest of the correspondence. 3 hours later, Lady Cecily found her in the blue drawing room, where she was replacing a lamp glass that had cracked in the cold. Lady Cecily's face told her everything. "Lady Prescott," she said with a particular controlled flatness, "has written to inform Edmund that she is prepared to overlook my provincial habits on the condition that he provides a supplementary settlement to account for the social expense of introducing a wife of my limited accomplishments into London circles." A pause. She did not say limited accomplishments. She said provincial habits requiring correction. She was very gracious about it. She was gracious in a way that made every word land exactly as she intended, and no court in England could call it an insult. Nora set down the lamp glass. "Edmund has been in the study for an hour with the letter," Lady Cecily said. "He asked not to be disturbed. He only asks not to be disturbed when he is managing something that would be worse if it escaped." She looked at Nora with something that was nearly an appeal, the look of a young woman who has found one person who speaks plainly to her and does not want to lose the thread. He will write back something measured and correct, and Lady Prescott will understand that she has established the terms. And I will spend the rest of my life being corrected. Her voice was entirely level. Her hands were not. "Nora," she said. The first time she had used the name. "What do I do?" Nora said, "You go into the study and tell your brother what you want. Not what is manageable, not what you can endure, what you want." Lady Cecily looked at her for a long moment. "What if what I want is to end the engagement entirely?" "Then say so," Nora said. "He arranged it. He will feel he has failed me." "He arranged it because he was trying to secure your future," Nora said. "If the arrangement does not secure it, he wants to know. He is not a man who prefers the appearance of order to the truth of it." Lady Cecily held her gaze for a long beat. Then she said quietly, "How long have you known him?" 3 years, Nora said. "That isn't quite what I asked," said Lady Cecily, and went to the study. Nora stood in the blue drawing room with the unlit lamp in her hands, and the particular sensation of a person who has handed someone else a candle, and is now standing in the dark, waiting to see where the light goes. She did not hear what passed between them. She learned it in pieces, the way one learns most things in a great house, through adjacency and inference. She heard the study door open at 4. She heard voices, his and Lady Cecily's, neither raised. She heard the footman called, and then a letter sealed and dispatched. Mrs. Fellows told her at supper that His Grace had written to Lord Prescott, not to his mother, to inform him that the proposed supplementary settlement was declined entirely, and that the condition of the match, as far as the Vane family was concerned, had always been and continued to be Lady Cecily's well-being. Lord Prescott, it emerged, had been waiting for exactly this. He wrote back within 2 days. He was, as Lady Cecily had said, not unkind, and had found his mother's management of the courtship increasingly uncomfortable, and had lacked only the weight of the Duke of Ashmore's explicit position to act against it. He proposed that the engagement continue on terms Lady Cecily herself approved, that his mother be informed of his decision, and that the question of any supplementary settlement be considered permanently closed. Lady Cecily read this letter at breakfast on Friday morning with color in her face that had not been there in a fortnight. "I think," she said, "that I may actually like him." She left Vane Park that afternoon. She stopped in the hall as she was pulling on her gloves, with the footman holding the door, and the carriage waiting, and the cold coming in. And she turned and looked at Nora, who stood near the housekeeper at the foot of the staircase. "You opened the door for me," she said, "in the middle of the night, when you had no reason to do more than call the housekeeper." "It seemed the right thing to do, my lady," Nora said. "It was more than the right thing," Lady Cecily said. She finished with her second glove and looked at Nora directly, with the clear, frank gaze of a young woman who has paid very close attention and arrived at a conclusion she is not going to walk back from. "My brother is fortunate in his household," she said. "More than he knows." And then she went out to the carriage. The house was quiet the following week. That particular quality of quiet that settles over a great house after its temporary guests have departed, when the regular machinery reasserts itself and the rooms returned to their ordinary scale. Nora went back to work. There was always more work. On Wednesday, the Duke of Ashmore did not go to London. After supper, when the house had settled for the night and the fire in the library had been built up, Nora came in to bank the coals and found him there. She had told herself, entering, that she had not expected him. She did not examine this statement closely. She came in with the coal scuttle, and he said, "Leave it. Sit down." She stopped. It was a grammatical impossibility, a sentence constructed in the wrong syntax for the room and the two people in it. No one said sit down to a maid. She stood where she was and looked at him, and his face held the expression she had spent 3 years learning not to read and had spent the last fortnight reading anyway. "Sit down," he said again. And this time the sentence had a different shape. Not a command. A request, with the word please following it, quiet and deliberate. She set the coal scuttle down. She did not sit. She stood at the edge of the firelight, which was perhaps a kind of compromise. And she waited. He was at the window. The candles on the desk had not been lit, and the only light was the fire. And in the fire's light his face was less composed than she was accustomed to seeing it, as though the composure were still present, but had been placed to one side rather than worn. "Cecily wrote to me," he said. She waited. She said a number of things about her time here that I had already been made aware of. He paused. She also said things I had not known. He turned from the window. "She said that you told her I would be worried about her rather than angry. She said she had not known how to read my face until you explained it to her, and that she had spent 19 years in this household without that information." A silence. "She said also that she had asked you how long you had known me, and that you said 3 years, and that she considered this not quite an answer to the question she had asked." The fire shifted. "Nora," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. He said it the way one says a word that has been held a long time without being spoken, with the full knowledge of what it costs to put it in the room. He said it without flourish and without retreat, and the sound of it in the firelit library was unlike anything she had been prepared for. She looked at him. "I have been trying," he said, "to find the precise moment at which what I feel for you became something I could no longer manage by not naming it. I have not found it. I can only tell you it was long enough ago that the beginning is no longer visible, which is not a condition I have been in before, and which I find I cannot address except directly." She did not move. She thought about the back stairs. She thought about the different doors. She thought about the precise architecture of the world they both occupied, the distances that had been constructed and maintained, and that she had never questioned, and had no reason to question. She said, "Your Grace." "Not in this room tonight," he said. "You have never been indistinct to me. Not for a day in 3 years. I want you to know that. Whatever else comes of my saying it." She stood in the firelight and looked at him, the Duke of Ashmore, and thought about all the corridors and all the rooms, and all the careful distance she had maintained, and all the moments she had walked away from, quickly, before they could become anything she would have to account for. She said, "I have not been managing it either." Something happened in his face. Not relief exactly, though relief was part of it. Something that had spent a long time as discipline and restraint, and now, allowed to be something else, did not quite know its own shape yet. He crossed the room, measured and deliberate, and he stopped in front of her with the firelight falling between them, and he said, "Tell me what you need me to know." She had spent 3 years learning the grammar of this house, she said. that I see you as you are, not as the room sees you, and that it is the most difficult thing I have ever allowed myself to know, because I could not unknow it, and I could see no use in knowing it. He said, "You thought nothing could come of it." "I knew nothing could come of it," she said, "or thought I knew." "You were not wrong," he said, "to think it then. I want to be clear about that. The difficulty has always been mine, not a failure of your understanding." He looked at her steadily. "I am asking whether there is a possibility, not a certainty, that what I feel could become something other than a burden to you, a beginning rather than an impossibility." She said, "There is." The fire burned. Outside, the November wind moved against the library windows, and the park was dark and cold and entirely indifferent to what passed between them, as parks tend to be, and the room held itself around them both. If you have been waiting for the moment where the world stops holding its breath, this is it. Set something down in the quiet, if you like. The arrangements required by the world outside a firelit library are not made in an evening. Nora did not become anything other than what she was, because she had stood in the library and said there is. The world required consultation, and the consultation required time. Edmund consulted it. He went to London. He spoke with his solicitor. He spoke with a peer he trusted, a man older than himself who had made a similar choice 30 years before and had found it answered. He wrote to Lady Cecily, whose reply arrived within a day and contained, among other warmer things, the acknowledgment that she had known it before she left the house, which was more than he apparently had, but that she could not hold it against him, as she had never known him to be anything but slow and sure in every matter that counted. He came back to Vane Park in December. He came to the kitchen garden in the cold gray morning of a Thursday, where Nora was cutting the last rosemary before the ground hardened. She heard his footsteps on the path behind her, and straightened without turning, because she had known it would be Thursday, and she had known it would be here, in the kitchen garden, in the cold, where they had first stood close enough to speak plainly to each other. He stopped at the wall. He said, "I would like to ask you something formally, if you would be willing to hear it formally." She turned and looked at him. There was frost on the top of the garden wall, and a thin skin of ice on the water butt, and the light was that particular pewter shade of light that comes in December in England and makes the whole world look both fragile and permanent at once. "I am asking," he said, "whether you would consent to be my wife." The wind moved through the dead garden canes. A rook called somewhere in the elms and was answered from a distance. Her breath was visible in the cold air, and his. "I would," she said. He said, "Good," in the way he had, longer than a word that short required, and the warmth behind it was unmistakable and entirely unguarded, and he looked at her across the frost-edged garden with his face entirely open in a way she had not seen it before and thought she might not stop thinking about for a very long time. She went inside and told Mrs. Fellows. She had to tell someone, and Mrs. Fellows had been at Vane Park for 31 years and received the news with the composure of a woman who has seen a great many things come round in the end, and said, "About time," and returned to her account book. There were those in the neighborhood who had opinions. Lady Marchmont, a widow of strong convictions and a drawing-room she had run for 25 years as a kind of private parliament, remarked at 2 separate dinner parties that the Duke of Ashmore had taken leave of his judgment. She said it pleasantly, at the pitch designed to travel. She said it in the same drawing-room where she had, the previous season, said a great many things about a great many women she considered unsuitable for a great many positions, and she said the word provincial, with an ease that suggested long practice. Edmund received all of it. He read Lady Marchmont's letter with Nora across the breakfast table from him in the morning room. In March, when the first snowdrops had come up outside, and the light was beginning to think about being spring, he passed the letter to her without comment. She read it. She set it down. She said, "She called me provincial." He looked at her. "Lady Cecily told me," Nora said. "Lady Prescott called her that. 3 times, she said, in 3 different settings. Lady Marchmont has now called me the same." She pushed the letter back across the table. "It appears to be the word they reach for when they require something to be smaller than it is." He was quiet. "And?" She looked out at the kitchen garden, where the snowdrops stood white and small against the dark earth, and where the bees were making their first uncertain investigations of the season, hopeful and slightly inaccurate, and where the rosemary had come back that she had cut in November and carried inside in a basket while he stood at the wall and told her she had character. "And I find that it does not land the way it is intended to," she said. "I did not know that would be true. I find that it is." He was quiet for a moment that held a particular quality. Then he said, "You opened the door for her, in the cold, at midnight, when you could have done the minimum required, and it would have been sufficient." "She needed someone," Nora said. "You did not think of what it might yield," he said. "You simply looked at what was needed and met it." "You did the same," she said, "when you wrote to Lord Prescott. You did not look for the easier resolution. You looked at what Cecily needed, and you did that. She told you about the letter." "She told me everything," Nora said. "She was here for 2 weeks with a great deal of time to think." He made the expression that in another man would have been a smile, and in him was something quieter and more settled than a smile. "She wrote to say she is happy," he said. "Lord Prescott, without his mother in the room, is apparently quite another man." "I am glad," Nora said. "She deserves to be happy." Outside, the bees were making their rounds of the snowdrops with the industrious confidence of creatures who do not know yet that everything is still very uncertain and who proceed on that basis. The light through the morning room window was doing what March light does in England, when it has been gray for a long time and remembers suddenly that it need not be, casting the room in something thin and particular and new. She had opened a door in November against the cold. She had sat in a kitchen at midnight with a young woman's distress and not made it smaller or larger than it was. She had carried trays and banked fires and folded linen and moved through a great house for 3 years as its invisible working order. She sat across the breakfast table from the man who had never once failed to see her, and felt the particular quality of a life which arranges itself while one is occupied with the ordinary acts of living it. Edmund reached across the table and laid his hand over hers, briefly, with the settled gentleness of a man who knows what he has and means to keep it. The snowdrops stood in their rows outside. The bees went on their rounds, unhurried, purposeful, attending to what was needed. Spring had found its way in, as it always does, through whatever door is left open.